Right here, not a word.
Wow. It's going to go on the internet. And then SA's going to hear it.
Am I on the internet for real?
Yeah.
Oh, man, you're just wrong.
I think among the 5 people or so who listen to my Bible study, you're a major celebrity.
I'll tell you. Did he tell you of all the thumbs up he's getting from Mr. Bill?
No.
He's probably got a couple hundred.
That's exactly.
I think they're going to make t-shirts.
So you become a real character in this movie.
Okay, so after I give my non-introduction, which I can now safely do because as of today, the last 2 lectures on Wisdom of Ben-Sirach are actually on the website. So you could actually go and listen to my original introduction on the first lecture about the Wisdom of Ben-Sirach now if you wanted to. We're going to get started in chapter 14. We left off at the end of 13 2 weeks ago. By way of non-introduction, the book of Ecclesiasticus is the Latin title, which means the church book, or the Wisdom of Ben-Sirach, which is, Ben-Sirach is, of course, Hebrew for the son of Sirach. It's actually written by Yeshua Ben-Sirach, sometimes transliterated from the Greek as Jesus Ben-Sirach or Joshua Ben-Sirach, depending on what translation you're reading. Was collected in the 2nd century BC. Was translated into Greek by his grandson. This book, as we said, was part of the Hebrew Old Testament until the middle of the 2nd century AD, at which point, because the Christian church was making so much use of it, they retroactively removed it. And that's where the Latin title Ecclesiasticus, the church book, comes from, because this was a book that was used for newly baptized Christians as sort of a catechism course to teach them how to live a Christian life. So in addition to being wisdom literature, as the last few books we've been reading, this is also wisdom literature that contains a lot of practical instruction, as we've been seeing, as we've been going through. So I'll leave that for the short introduction. Does anybody have any questions left over from previously or just in general? Or? Okay, so chapter 14. Blessed is a man who does not slip and fall because of his mouth, and is not stung with pain caused by his sin. Blessed is he whose soul does not condemn him and who has not fallen away from his hope. Wealth is not fitting for a small-minded man, and to what end is wealth for an envious man? For he who gathers for himself gathers for others, and others will live in luxury with his goods. If a man does evil to himself, for whom shall he do good? And he will not rejoice in his wealth. What's that talking about? It's for he who gathers for himself gathers for others. It's talking about that idea that you spend your whole life piling up greater and greater wealth, earning all this money, and then what happens? Well, eventually you die, and someone inherits it, or the government takes it, or both, you know. And so that's the what good is. Wealth is not fitting for a small-minded man. To what end is wealth for an envious man? Right? What good does it ultimately do you? You spend all your life chasing it and piling it up. You never really get to enjoy it. Someone else does. Right? So this is sort of the story of Conrad Hilton. Right? You go and make all this money, and then you leave it to Paris Hilton. Spend it all stupidly.
Does that mean I have to get rid of that bumper sticker I bought years ago that says, "He who dies with the most toys wins"?
Yes. Unless you were having a particular contest with some of the people to see who can die with the most toys. So verse 6, when a man envies himself, there is no one worse off, and this is the reward for his vice. Even if he does good, he does it unintentionally, and in the end he reveals his evil. He who envies with his eye is evil. He turns away his face and despises souls. The eye of a greedy man is not satisfied with his share, and useless wrongdoing dries up the soul. The evil eye of a man is envious over his bread, thus it is lacking at his table. So, what is this talking about? This envy and greed are both sins that sort of, you never reach an end point. Right? When you're envious, or greedy, no matter how much you get, it's never enough. Right? And so it just pulls you along until it destroys you completely. Again, the person is never happy. Right? Because there's always something more that he doesn't have. If he has $10 million in the bank, well, he doesn't have $50 million in the bank. And if he gets $50 million, well, then he doesn't have $100 million. If he gets $100 million, well, then he's not a billionaire. So it just continues on and on and on. So verse 11, my son, whatever you have, treat yourself well and offer sacrifices worthily to the Lord. All right, so he says, whatever you have, this is again in that context we see the wisdom of your father addressing his son, whatever you have, whether it's a little or a lot. Right? There's a little or a lot. Number one, enjoy it, because that's the opposite, right? The opposite of what the greedy man does. He never enjoys it, because it's never enough. Right? Enjoy it, be thankful for it. Right? And then offer sacrifices to God. Be thankful to God for it. Give some of it back to God, whether it's a little or a lot. Remember that death does not delay, and the covenant of Hades has not been shown to you. Covenant of Hades meaning, the date you're set to die. Right? May exist, but you don't know what it is. Before you die, do good to a friend, and reach out and give to him based on your ability. Do not let a day go by without doing something good, and do not let any of your desire for doing good escape you. Will you not leave all your hard work to another, and all your hard work to be divided by lot? Give and receive and deprive yourself, because in Hades there is nowhere to seek luxury. So he's saying, if you do have things, give them away. Do good with them. Give them to other people. Because if you die, you go into the grave, there aren't any resorts. You don't need to save up. Where you're going, they don't take American Express, right? So there's no point. Nope.
I got to give away my $5 million.
Yeah, I'll help you with that.
Alms for the poor.
Verse 17, all flesh becomes old like a garment, for the covenant from of old is, you shall die by death. That's kind of a weird translation. We talked about that back in Genesis 1. It's the Hebrew phrase literally is dying you will die. And what it means is it just means you're going to die. For sure. Right? It's a way of emphasizing it. So they translated it into Greek very literally, and then from Greek to English very literally. But that it's not like that old comedy movie Murder by Death. It's that you will certainly die. There's no loophole. There's no way you're going to squeak out of it. You're going to be the one person who lives and doesn't die. Verse 18, like flourishing leaves on a thick tree which sheds some leaves and puts forth others, so also is the generation of flesh and blood. One dies and another is born. Every work of man decays and fails, and he who made it will depart with it. Blessed is the man who practices wisdom and discourses with insight. Whoever ponders the ways of wisdom in his heart will also reflect on her secrets. Pursue wisdom like a tracker and lie in wait on her paths. He who looks intently through her windows will also listen at her doors. He who lodges near her house will also fasten his tent peg to her walls. He will establish his home according to her will, and so lodge in a good dwelling place. He will put his children in her shelter and lodge under her branches. He will be sheltered by her from the burning heat and will dwell in her glory. He who fears the Lord will do this, and he who holds fast to the law will obtain wisdom. She will come to meet him like a mother and accept him like the wife of one's youth. She will feed him the bread of understanding and give him the water of wisdom to drink. He will be supported by her and not fall, and he will hold on to her and not be put to shame. She will exalt him alongside his neighbors, and in the midst of the assembly she will open his mouth. You will find gladness and a crown of rejoicing, and will inherit an everlasting name. But foolish men will not find her, and sinful men will not see her. She is far from the arrogant, and lying men will not keep her in mind. Praise is not proper in the mouth of a sinner, because it was not sent from the Lord. For praise should be spoken in wisdom, then the Lord will prosper it. Verse 11, do not say, I fell away because of the Lord, for he will not do what he hates. Do not say, it was he who led me astray, for he has no need of a sinful man. Now you may say, who says that? Right? Who gets caught doing something and says, oh, God made me sin. They may get the devil made me do it, but you don't get God made me sin. At least not those words. At least not those words. But what you do get is, things have been really hard lately. I don't know why God lets all these things keep happening to me. I don't know why he does this to me, you know.
Priests hear this with
gospel all the time. You go around, you get at it in a very roundabout way, but it comes down to all these problems I'm having really aren't my fault, they're God's fault. And he should fix them, and I'm kind of mad that he hasn't. Right? That you know, all these things that have happened to me, you know, God did them to me. Verse 13, the Lord hates all abominations, and they are not loved by those who fear him. He himself created man in the beginning and left him in the counsel of his will. If you will, you will keep the commandments and faithfully do his good pleasure. So he's talking about, he created man, he gave human beings free will to choose what they want. And here's about as blunt as we've seen it since Deuteronomy. Verse 16, he has set before you fire and water. If you will, stretch forth your hand. You can put your hand in the water and clean it. You can put your hand in the fire and it's going to get burned. But if you go and you stick your hand in a fire, there's no use yelling at the fire for burning it. Right? That stupid fire burned my hand. Right? Okay? And there's no use yelling at God for there having been a fire there in the first place. You know?
And what if I don't stretch out my hand at all? I'm scared.
Well, then you'll either have a clean hand or a burned hand. But the point being, what happens to us almost invariably is the result of our own decisions. It's the result of our own decisions. Or at the very least, that's where we need to look first. Right? What are the things that I did that got me where I am now? Right? When we get lung cancer, we think about all those cigarettes we smoked. We don't jump to, God, why did you give me lung cancer? Right? When we have heart trouble, you know, I look at all the Big Macs I ate. Not, God, why did you cause me to be born with such a weak heart?
Or the triple baconator.
The triple baconator at Wendy's, yeah.
You do tell what
I
you
know
say.
he likes. He doesn't eat Big Macs.
Yeah. Well, they had 2 for $2.
Whoa.
Anyway, so but the point being, we look at our own decisions first, right? And almost invariably, we can trace a whole bunch of bad decisions we made that lead us to exactly where we are now. If we look at it in the big picture, And so that's what he's saying here, right? We need to start by blaming ourselves, not by blaming God. Verse 17, life and death are before mankind, and whichever he chooses, it will be given to him. Right? We talked about the 2 roads. Right? If you choose death, death is what you're going to receive. Right? That's not God being a mean and angry God and looking to punish people. That's, you chose it, he gave it to you. He gave you what you thought you wanted. Verse 18, for great is the wisdom of the Lord. He is mighty in power and sees all things. His eyes are upon those who fear him, and he himself knows every deed of man. He has commanded no one to be ungodly, and he has given no one license to sin. So that second part, obviously we know he doesn't command people to sin, But he doesn't give anybody permission either. Right? There is no situation that you can concoct that leads to, well, it's okay for me to do this in this situation.
Is verse 19, is that used in the services sometimes? His eyes are upon those who fear him, and he himself knows every need of man.
His eyes are upon those who fear him is, and it's a quote from a psalm.
Okay.
So, chapter 16, verse 1, do not desire a multitude of useless children, nor rejoice in ungodly sons. Well, of course, who wants a multitude of useless children? Well, the point being, remember, a lot of the wisdom literature we've been reading has been focused on separating sort of popular folk wisdom from real wisdom. Right? Remember, popular folk wisdom is, if you live to a ripe old age, then you're blessed, and if you die young, you're cursed. Well, we've already seen, well, not necessarily. Right? Not necessarily. Well, this is that folk wisdom. If you have children, especially a lot of children, then you're blessed. And if you don't have children for some reason, or if you've had very few children, then you're cursed by God. Right? Well, let's stop and think about that for a second. What good is a multitude of useless children? If you have 9 or 10 kids, and they're all useless and ungodly, wouldn't you rather have maybe 1 or 0, right? Than have all those kids who are wicked? Verse 2, if they multiply, do not rejoice over them, if the fear of the Lord is not in them. Do not trust in their life, nor pay attention to their multitude. For one godly child is better than 1,000, and it is better to die childless than to have ungodly children. For from one child with wisdom a city will be filled with people, but a tribe of lawless men will make it desolate. My eyes have seen many such things, and my ear has heard worse things than this. In the congregation of sinners a fire will be kindled, and in a disobedient nation wrath is kindled. There was no atonement for the ancient giants who turned away from God because of their strength. What's that referring to? Remember, that's Genesis 6:1, where it talks about the Nephilim, right? The men of renown. Right. In verse 8, he did not spare the cities where Lot sojourned, whom he detested because of their arrogance, Sodom and Gomorrah. He had no mercy on a nation destined for destruction who were taken away because of their sins. The same thing happened to the 600,000 foot soldiers who gathered together in their hardness of heart. Those are the people who died in the wilderness coming out of Egypt. Even if there was only one stiff-necked man, it would be a marvel if he were to remain unpunished. For mercy and wrath belong to the Lord, and he is mighty to forgive, and he pours out wrath. As great is his mercy, so also great is his rebuke, and he will judge a man according to his works. A sinner will not escape with his spoils, and the patience of a godly man will not fare badly. He will make a place for every act of mercy. Each will find this out according to his works. Right, so this sounds pretty harsh. Remember, we've got to take it in the context of what we just read about the fire and the water. Right? Those are flip sides of the same coin. One is from God's perspective, one is from our perspective. Right? From our perspective, we make choices, and those choices have consequences. Right? And we receive the consequences of our actions. Choose to stick your hand in a fire, you get burned. Right? From God's perspective, right? God has forgiveness, he has mercy. Right? But he also, if people are unrepentant, people continue to choose death, continue to choose the fire, continue to choose destruction, he'll give them that too. If that's what they want, or think they want. And so it's the same thing from the two sides. So on the day of judgment, whatever happens to us is what we've earned. Right? Whatever happened to us is the result of our actions. If we've repented, God will show us mercy. If we haven't, he won't. And we won't have anyone to blame but ourselves. We'll be able to sit there and say, oh God, you're being too harsh in your judgment, right? Or, that's not a fair standard. Because he's going to be giving us exactly what we've wanted, exactly what we've chosen, over and over and over again. And so this is why St. Paul says the wages of sin is death. You work all day, the boss hands you a check, right? You might say thank you to be polite, but you earned it. Right? That's the amount of money you earned for the work you did. Well, if you spend the day sinning, at the end of the day, when you receive death as a consequence, there's no appeal. You've gotten exactly what you were working toward. Yeah.
Okay, my question here, when we go back to verse 10, and it says the same thing happened to the 600,000 foot soldiers. Okay, gathered in their hardness of heart. Didn't we discuss about the metaphor of this, that there really weren't that many people coming out of Egypt? Or when we went back and like the families going into Israel, maybe 28 people, the family of something, when we were talking about numbers, and like I think your example was Saul has killed his 1,000 and David his 10,000. Okay, this number of 600,000.
Well, this is referring us back to that story.
From that many from Egypt, would there really be that many?
Well, but the point isn't the exact number, right? Because the number is going to be different whether you look at the Hebrew or the Greek.
Yeah.
The point is he's referring you back to that story, right? He's not the number isn't the issue. He's saying he's giving these examples of people who hardened their heart and didn't repent and what happened to them, right? Because he's saying, if you're sitting here today thinking to yourself, well, God's just really nice, right? And God's just really merciful, and God's love, right? So it doesn't matter what I do. I can live my life however I want to, and in the end, He'll have mercy on me, and everything will be fine, right? He's saying, well, what about those giants? Remember back before the flood? They didn't get any mercy. Remember Sodom and Gomorrah? They didn't repent. They didn't get any mercy. Remember all those Israelites who died in the desert coming out of Egypt because they hardened their hearts and wouldn't repent? They didn't get any mercy. So what makes you think today that if you don't repent, that if you harden your heart the way they did, what makes you think He's going to show any more mercy to you than He showed to them?
Well, here's the question here. For mercy and wrath, and we go to verse 11, belong to the Lord. And we just brought up a person's terminal illness, okay? Their suffering, their pain, and good people. Okay, not somebody that's, okay, I'm really a rotten guy, I deserve this. Okay? But maybe good people going through death pangs, whether disease they may come down with. How do we justify it? I'm not blaming this on God. But how does somebody then, in that state, receive mercy to alleviate the pain?
Often death is that mercy. Remember, God when he said that He was going to cut man off from the tree of life in Genesis. Right? What He says is it's not good for man to live forever in this state he's in now.
Yes.
Once we've chosen to sin, once we've brought destruction upon ourselves, living forever, in this world, in this mortal state, would be terrible. It'd be a nightmare. It'd be hell on earth. Right? And so He says, as a mercy, He says, we're going to cut them off of the tree of life. They're going to die. I'm going to put a limit. I'm going to put a limit on this, so that suffering can only go so far. Right? So that wickedness can only go so far. And then after the flood, after all the evil that caused the flood, after the flood, He says, I'm going to shorten that even more. Remember, He says it's going to be 120 years, right? Tops.
Yeah.
Right? I'm going to shorten that even more. Put it, reel in those limits even more.
That was really, may I ask this question? Is that basically the shortening of our life expectancy to help us with our salvation.
Yes.
Okay, and in doing
To bring us to
so,
repentance. Yeah.
okay, in doing so, if we continually, again, I've always brought this question up about repenting means to stop. Okay, if we are able to repent, then we're almost perfect, if you will. I mean, it's to me, it's a sin and forgiveness is a vicious cycle. I don't know really how.
Well, it is. It's a continuous struggle.
Yeah.
From the time you first start sinning, which is
But
usually your first one. I like how St. Augustine said the only thing that stopped him from sinning as a baby was the shortness of his limbs. His arms and legs weren't strong enough for him to really get up to much. But if he could have, he would have.
having a finite time, it's as Father Stephen is saying, helps us, to realize, hopefully realize, that we've got to make changes, before the end comes. Because the greatest lie of Satan is not that there isn't a God, that there's not a devil, that there's not such a thing as death and sin. It's that you have time. The lie is, put it off. You don't need to confess today. Wait until tomorrow. Wait until the next day. There's always mañana. Abukra, which is one Syrian told me is worse than the Spanish mañana. Tomorrow.
And that's what he was getting at when he talked about, you haven't seen the covenant of Hades, right? You don't know when that date is.
Yeah.
Right? And he says death doesn't delay, meaning you can't, when you see it coming, you can't call a timeout. Right? And say, give me another week to straighten some stuff out and then come back. We don't get that. Right? And so we need to be ready continuously. We need to be repenting now. We need to be seeking His mercy now.
This is one of the reasons why I've changed my own personal thought, having encountered more and more people that I've had to pastor to that have terminal illness. It's a blessing. It's a blessing. Because you can be walking, you can be perfectly healthy and everything's going fine, and how many times you hear the person, who all of a sudden got finished playing around in golf, a tennis match, everything's feeling great, comes home, sits down in his chair, bang, gone. Heart attack, All that unrepentant sin in his life is finished. When you have a terminal illness, you have time to deal with things.
Yeah.
It makes a reality.
Whether it's a few weeks or a few months or whatever it is, you could,
I've many times watched people, clean up their life day by day.
Yeah.
With people around.
But that's not guaranteed to any of us.
That's not guaranteed to any of us. But,
So, yeah. Okay. So verse 15, another related mistake. Do not say, I will be hidden from the Lord, and who will remember me from on high? I will not be known among so many people. For what is my soul in comparison to the immeasurable creation? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven, the abyss and the earth will be shaken at His visitation. And at the same time, the mountains and the foundations of the earth will shake with trembling when He looks upon them. No heart will be able to think about these things, and who will ponder His ways? There will be a sudden blast of wind which no man will see, for most of His works will be done in secret. Who will proclaim His works of righteousness, or who will endure them? For His covenant is far off. This is what a man thinks who is diminished in heart and without discernment, who is deceived and thinks foolishly. Right? It's basically saying, I'm going to slip through the cracks. Right? I'm just one little guy. I'm not important. Right? I'm sure God's worried about, all the things the president's doing. Right? Because, he's starting wars and ending war. People's lives are at stake, But me, I'm just hanging around Charleston. I'll just slip through the cracks. I'll just, the whole judgment thing, I'll just get a pass. I don't do anything real bad or real good. Right? And he's saying that this is foolishness. Right? This is foolishness. Verse 22, listen to me, my son, and gain knowledge, and pay close attention to my words in your heart. I will reveal instruction with balance, and I will proclaim knowledge with exactness. By the judgment of the Lord his works exist from the beginning, and from their creation he determined their boundaries. He ordered his works forever, and their principles according to their generations. They neither hunger nor grow weary, and they do not cease from their works. Each does not afflict the one close to him, and they will never disobey his word. After this the Lord looked upon the earth and filled it with his good things. He covered its surface with the life of every living creature, and to it they will return again. Now, the first part he's talking about God creating the earth and the sun and the moon and the stars, right? Which don't get hungry or sleepy. They just keep going in their patterns. And you can tell he's sort of, although he doesn't bring it out, he's sort of making a contrast there. They don't disturb their neighbor. They just sort of continually follow what God set for them to do. There's no interruption, there's no trespassing. Chapter 17, the Lord created man from the earth and returned him to it again. He gave them a certain number of days and an appointed time, and he gave them authority over it. He clothed them in strength like his own and made them in his image. He put the fear of man upon all flesh and gave him dominion over wild animals and birds. He gave mankind the ability to deliberate, and a tongue, eyes, and ears, and a heart to think with. He filled them with the skill of comprehension and showed them good and evil. He set his eye upon their hearts to show them the majesty of his works. They will praise his holy name so as to fully describe the majesty of his works. So, here's human beings, right? And you notice the things he emphasizes is human beings have the ability to deliberate, to think, to make choices. All right? To make choices. And they've been given authority by God, meaning they're responsible for those choices, right? And for the results of those choices. Verse 9, he added knowledge to them and gave them the law of life as a heritage. He established an eternal covenant with them, and he showed his judgments to them. Their eyes saw his glorious majesty, and their ears heard his glorious voice. He said to them, beware of all unrighteousness, and he commanded each of them concerning his neighbor. Their ways are before him continually, they will not be hidden from his eyes. He appointed a ruler for every nation, but Israel is the Lord's portion. All his works are as the sun before him, and his eyes are continually on their ways. Their wrongdoings are not hidden from him, and all their sins are before the Lord. A man's almsgiving is like a seal with him, and he will treasure the kindness of a man like the pupil of his eye. After this he will arise and repay them, and he will reward them with retribution on their head. But he provides a return to those who repent, and he comforts those who lack endurance. So this is answering that foolish person who thinks he's unimportant and is going to slip through the cracks. He says, the same God who created the sun, the moon, the stars, all these things, the animals, the birds, nature, also created human beings, and not just human beings in general, but each human being. Right? And he gave you the ability to choose, and he's aware of what choices you're making and what you're doing. Right? Those are important to him. Verse 20, turn to the Lord and forsake your sins, and pray in his presence and reduce your offense. Return to the Most High and turn away from wrongdoing, and hate an abomination exceedingly. Who will praise the Most High in Hades, as do the living and those who give thanks? Thanksgiving ceases from a dead man, since he is no longer alive. Only the living and the healthy will praise the Lord. How great the mercy of the Lord is, and his atonement for those who turn to him. For all things are not possible for man, because the Son of Man is not immortal. What shines brighter than the sun? Yet this light fails, and so will flesh and blood when it lays evil to heart. He examines the host of the highest heaven, but all men are earth and ashes. Chapter 18, he who lives forever created everything. The Lord alone will be declared righteous. He permitted no one to proclaim his works, for who can trace out his mighty works? Who will measure his majestic power with a number? And who will add to this measure while describing his mercies? There is no one who can add or subtract, and there is no one who can search out the wonders of the Lord. When a man completes his search, then he starts over, and when he stops, he will still be perplexed. What is man and what use is he? What is his good and what is his evil? The number of a man's days is considered great if he is 100 years old. But like a drop of water from the sea and a grain of sand, so are a few years within a day of eternity. Therefore the Lord is patient with them and pours out his mercy upon them. He sees and knows their end, that it is evil. Therefore he makes full atonement for them. The mercy of a man is upon his neighbor, but the mercy of the Lord is upon all flesh, rebuking, training, and teaching them like a shepherd who returns his flock to the fold. He has mercy on those who receive his discipline and who are eager for his judgment. So, notice the two things that are held in tension here. God is aware of man's weakness. As it says, if somebody lives to be 100 years old, we think, wow, that's really old. Compare that to God's eternity. Right? Compare that to the age of the earth. Compare that to God's creation. It's tiny, it's nothing. But God's response to how weak and how prone to sin humanity is not here more wrath. Right? It's not, he realizes man is earth and ashes, so he crushes him down and gives him the judgment he deserves. His response is mercy. Right? His response is mercy. And notice verse 11, he sees and knows their end, that it is evil. Right? He knows that human beings, not some of them, not most of them, human beings in general, are on this wrong road. Right? He knows it. He sees it. He sees where it's headed. And so what does he do? Therefore, he makes full atonement for them. Not therefore he calls for them to repent. And if they do, then maybe he'll show mercy. Right? He makes full atonement for them. This is what St. Paul is talking about when he talks about Christ's crucifixion. He said, at just the right time, while you were still sinners, while you were still on this path, Christ died for you. Not when you cleaned up your act. Not after you all started following the law and all became circumcised. No, while you were still out there sinning, Christ died for you. God provided for your salvation. Because he took pity on you. Because he loved you. Despite how weak and frail you are. Despite the fact that we keep making the wrong choices. And choosing our own destruction. Instead of choosing life with him that he offers to us. Despite that, he continues to try and bring us back.
So we don't escape his wrath, but he makes full atonement.
Right.
Sort of the classic. How do you interpret those two?
Because atonement has nothing to do with wrath. Atonement is about the possibility of repentance.
Possibility.
Yeah.
It's not escaping.
No.
Escaping his wrath.
No, it's about the opportunity for repentance. Right. What it is we're on our way to our own destruction. That's what we choose. Right? God opens up for us this path that leads the other way.
Everybody doesn't need to wrath, does it?
No.
So you're escaping. So you're
Well,
escaping.
in a sense.
By atoning, by repenting, you're escaping the wrath.
By repenting, you're leaving this road and getting onto this road.
You're getting away from the wrath.
If you want to look at it that way, yeah. Although it depends on what you mean, because you're still going to have to deal with the consequences of the choices you made. But
You might fall under the consequence of someone else's.
but the point being, it isn't that we change, right, and we then become worthy of salvation. We change, and now we're worthy to go and spend eternity sharing God's life with Him. It's God opens up a way for that to happen because He takes pity on us and has mercy on us and loves us, even though we've done nothing to move in that direction or deserve it. Right, which is, as it says in verse 12, the mercy of a man is upon his neighbor, but the mercy of the Lord is upon all flesh, rebuking, training, and teaching them like a shepherd who returns his flock to the fold. Right? And notice it says all flesh, not Israel. It says all flesh. It says every human being. Right? Is part of this flock. And so this is what, contrary to our Mormon friends, when Jesus in the Gospel of John says, I have other sheep who are not of this fold, and he's talking to the Jews, he means the Gentiles. He means the rest of the world are part of that flock too. Right? He doesn't mean the Native Americans. These will come over here, appear separately, like the Mormons. Interpret that. But the Native Americans are included as Gentiles, I suppose. But that's what it means. The whole world, all flesh, is part of this flock, on whom God has mercy. But notice, again in verse 12, the way he brings this about, the first word is rebuking. So, in that sense, you're not escaping wrath. You're rebuke, correction, discipline, right, are good things when they're coming from God, and you're being
turning away
corrected.
From the things that cause wrath.
Hopefully, yeah. But so, by rebuking, training, and teaching. God's motivated by love, but that doesn't mean that when he comes to us to get us onto this path that we don't have to be corrected, that there's not some discipline coming, that it's not going to be hard, that we're not going to have to deal with the consequences of the choices we made before, where we just wash our hands of it and walk away. It's like the example I've given before. If you commit adultery, if you cheat on your spouse, you can't just come to confession and say, no, honey, I confessed it. It's done. You can't bring it up to me anymore, right? That's not going to work. Right? It's not going to happen. There's still consequences that we have to deal with. Right? Because it isn't ultimately, it isn't just about us saying some words or doing a ritual. It's about us being transformed through that training, that rebuking, that teaching. So verse 14. My son, do not bring disgrace on the good you have done, nor cause grief by your words when you make a gift. Does not dew give relief from the burning heat? In the same way, a word is better than a gift. Indeed, is not a word better than a fitting gift, and both are found in a gracious man. A fool will insult and disgrace someone, and the gift of an envious man makes his eyes waste away. Before you speak, learn, and before you get sick, take care of your health. So that seems to be pretty logical, right? Before you go out and try and teach something, before you go out and try and pontificate on some subject, you should actually learn about that subject first. Not everyone does that, but it helps, right? The second part, before you get sick, take care of your health. Right? That's when it's important to take care of your health, is before you get sick. So now in the same way, verse 19, before you make a judgment, examine yourself closely, and in the hour of visitation you will find atonement. Right? Before we start judging others, judge ourselves. Verse 20, before you become sick, humble yourself, and at the time of sinning, prove your conversion. Let nothing hinder you from paying a vow promptly, and do not wait until death to become righteous. That's what we were talking about before. Right? A day before I die, then I'll start living right. Before you make a vow, prepare yourself, and do not become like a man who tempts the Lord. Remember his anger on the day of your death, at the time of vengeance when he turns his face away. Remember the time of hunger and the time of plenty, and poverty and need in the days of wealth. From morning until evening time changes, and all things are soon in the presence of the Lord. A wise man will have the fear of God in everything he does, and in these days of sin he will guard against wrongdoing. Every intelligent man knows wisdom and praises the one who finds her. The wise in words, they also make others wise, and they pour forth accurate proverbs. So this is talking about, we've just talked about mercy and forgiveness for sins, right? This is backing up a step, right? This is let's prepare ourselves so that we don't run into the sin in the first place. Right? That's the take care of your health before you get sick. Right? Prepare yourself for the times when temptation is going to come. Right?
And likens being sick to sinning in verse 20.
Right.
Used interchangeably.
And so like in verse 24, remember the time of hunger and the time of plenty and poverty and the days of wealth. Right? When you've got a lot, remember what it was like to not have much. If you remember that, then it'll keep you from going astray into sin with your wealth. And vice versa. When you're poor, remember all the times when you've had enough. Right? Those times will come again. That'll stop you from falling into despair and sinning because of poverty. So verse 29, do not walk after your own desires, but restrain your appetites. If you fill your soul with a desire for pleasure, it will make you the laughing stock of your enemies. Do not rejoice in great luxury, lest you become needy by its expense. Do not become a beggar by feasting on borrowed money when you have nothing in your purse. So those 4 verses, I think, are a pretty good summary of American culture in the 21st century. You've got walking after your own desires, right? So whatever you think is going to make you happy, whatever you think is going to be a good time, whatever you think is going to bring you pleasure. Verse 30, if you fill your soul with the desire for pleasure, it will make you the laughingstock of your enemies. 31, do not rejoice in great luxury, which we're all after. We have the richest poor people in the world here. Because we have poor people who have an Xbox and a flat screen HD TV and but everybody's seeking this lifestyle, right? Whether they have a little bit of money or a lot of money, everybody's seeking, this lifestyle, the newest stuff. We got to have this stuff. And then of course verse 32, do not become a beggar by feasting on borrowed money when you have nothing in your purse. Right?
Off the credit card.
That's
Not
That's
only
your-
that, but the whole country.
yeah. That,
17
You
trillion
just think they're
dollars.
all good.
you don't have any money, but you
We got a credit
can lay hands on some.
I'm spending my great-grandchildren's money.
Yeah. I was especially bad that way in college. And Citibank sent me a credit card. I thought they just sent me $2,000. I could now go spend however I want. And just pay them $20 a month after that. And then the next card came and I said, hey, another $2,000 already. And of course, you end up, verse 32, you become a beggar by feasting on borrowed money. That's the irony. Right? For a while, you have the lifestyle, you have the luxury, you have all these things you want that you think are going to make you happy. And then you end up broke and losing them all. If you had lived where you were in the first place, right, you would have been fine all along. If you had lived within your means, rather than trying to live up here and ending up down here.
Yeah, can't live up like the Scots.
No, you're all right.
That's just putting on airs. Chapter 19, a working man who is a drunk will not become wealthy, and he who despises small things will fail little by little. Wine and women will draw away intelligent men, and he who joins himself to prostitutes shall become very reckless. Decay and worms shall inherit him, and his reckless soul will be carried away. What's going on? There's sort of a flip, right? He goes out, he's drinking all his alcohol and sort of conspicuous consumption, right? And then the worms and decay end up eating him, right, in the end. Verse 4, he who trusts quickly is unwise in heart, and he who sins will err against his own soul. He who rejoices in evil shall be condemned, and he who hates talkativeness will sin less. Never repeat a word, and you will lose nothing at all. There's your real short condemnation of gossiping. If you never pass on to anyone, if you never repeat to anyone anything you hear, what will you have lost? Nothing. Right. So, not gossiping costs you nothing. Verse 8, with friend or enemy, do not report it. And unless it is a sin for you, do not reveal it. For someone heard you and watched you, and in time will hate you. Have you heard a word? Let it die with you. Take courage, it will not burst you. You hear something juicy, and it's like, oh, I gotta go.
But it sure feels like it.
Yeah, but I bet you're not actually going to explode if you don't let it out. But a fool will suffer birth pangs because of such a word, like a woman in labor with a child. Like an arrow stuck in the flesh of a thigh, so is a word inside a fool. Question a friend, perhaps he did not do it, and if he did something, perhaps he will not repeat it. Question a neighbor, perhaps he did not say it, and if he did say it, may he not say it twice. Question a friend, for often it is slander, so do not believe every word. A person slips, but it was not his intention. For who has not sinned with his tongue? Question your neighbor before you threaten him, and give place to the law of the Most High.
So if I want that question, my neighbor is okay with that?
No. The idea being, for example, the question to neighbor, perhaps he did not say it. You hear through the great, so-and-so said such and such. Right? Well, why don't you go ask so-and-so about it? Did you really say such and such? Maybe he didn't. Right? Or maybe he wouldn't say it twice, meaning maybe he said it, but now he regrets it.
Somebody needs to put that on Facebook.
Yeah. Shut down Facebook. Right? Because that way when you go, that solves the problem, right? Instead of just passing on what you heard to someone else, which just exacerbates and spreads the problem. Verse 18, all wisdom is the fear of the Lord, and in all wisdom there is the doing of the law. Wisdom is not the knowledge of evil, nor is there discernment in the counsel of sinners. There is a cleverness that is an abomination, and there is a fool who is lacking in wisdom. Better is a man who is afraid but lacks understanding than a man who abounds in discernment but transgresses the law. Right, that's an important. James, you asked about what if you're afraid and so you don't put your hand in the fire or the water, right? It's better if you don't understand something or don't know what to do, right? You're afraid to do nothing than to blunder in and sin. Is what it's saying. There is a precise cleverness which itself is unjust, and there is one who is offensive that justice may be revealed. There is an evildoer bowed down in mourning, but inwardly he is full of deceit. He covers his face and pretends to be deaf, but when no one notices, he will take advantage of you. If he is prevented from sinning because he lacks strength, when he later finds an opportunity, he will do evil. A man will be known by his appearance, and a man of intelligence will be known by his countenance when you meet him. The clothing of a man and the way he laughs and walks give indication of who he is. So now I need to reconsider a lot of my t-shirts. But what that's saying is by the way we present ourselves, we project an awful lot about ourselves, about how we see ourselves, what we think about ourselves. And this is what I talk about with the teens. Whenever I go and the teens ask me questions, there's a couple things that always come up. One of them is always tattoos. They always ask me, is it a sin to get tattoos? And I say, well, listen. See, if you get a tattoo, you're communicating something about yourself, right? And pretty permanently. Because it's pretty expensive and painful to get one removed. You can, but, okay. You're communicating something about yourself. So you need to stop and think very carefully. What is it I am communicating about myself? Right? When I get this tattoo. To whom am I communicating it? Will I still want to be communicating this 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now? Right? When that little butterfly you got right here looks like a giant vulture because you're 73. And your grandchildren run in fear, right? might you regret it at that point, right? And think, this wasn't the best idea, right? Or you get a spider tattooed on your face, and then no one will hire you, and you don't know why, right? So, right, the way we present ourselves says a lot about ourselves. And we can sit around and be childish and say, well, people should learn about who I am before they judge me, right? But the reality is, we're telling them, we're yelling things at them by the way we present ourselves and the way we talk and the way we act in front of them. Right? And so that's where we need to start. If everybody's getting the wrong impression of you, you need to change the way you're presenting yourself to people. Yeah.
What is this cleverness that's an abomination? Is that pride?
Well, cleverness, remember the snake in the garden was the most subtle and the cleverest of all the animals. Right? So he's making the distinction between real wisdom, right? Real wisdom which comes from God, real understanding of God and His creation and how it works, right? And the way of life that leads to life, and just sort of being clever, right? Because there are a lot of people who are clever, right? Who pull off clever schemes. I mean, there are a lot of really clever people in the stock market around 2007. Right? Who would come up with really clever ways to get rich, to make money, right? But that cleverness isn't the wisdom that comes from God. Right? That's what he's talking about, saying there's a difference. If they were really wise, right, then they'd be following God's law. They know that their get-rich-quick scheme isn't going to make them happy in the end, right? That their greed is going to lead them, desolate.
Could it be someone who, reads the Bible and interprets it for themselves and thinks they know what they're talking about?
Yeah, it could be.
That doesn't.
I mean, he's talking about just that cleverness and intelligence. There's a lot of clever people who are scam artists or who are deceived or who just are arrogant and think they understand more than they actually understand. He's talking about all that. He's talking about all that. That there's a difference between really having wisdom, really knowing God, and having wisdom, and just being clever or smart.
So what does he mean?
And being clever or smart isn't necessarily good, depending on how you use it.
So what does he mean by an abomination? Does that mean it makes God mad or what?
Right, that it's sinful, that it's horrible. It's not a good. It's the opposite of a blessing. Right. Okay, chapter 20. There is a rebuke which is not timely, and there is he who is silent but has discernment. How much better it is to rebuke than to seethe with anger. He who confesses his fault will be kept from loss. Like the desire of a eunuch to violate a maiden, so is the man who executes justice by violence. Now there's a kind of creepy example. So, the desire of a eunuch to violate a maiden. A eunuch, obviously, is someone who had been castrated. Right? And in various courts at that time, there would be slaves who were castrated for various reasons. For example, the people who were going to guard the king's harem of wives would all be castrated so that the king didn't have to worry about them going in and messing around with his harem. Right? Just as an example. So, there's this eunuch, he's been castrated, he wants to go and do something with this young woman. Well, he can't do anything. He's not going to be able to do it. Right? He's been castrated. Right? So is the man who executes justice by violence. Right? He's filled with this passion, he's filled with this anger. Right? That he thinks is motivated by a good thing. He's filled with this anger, so he goes out and does violence, but he can't really accomplish justice. Justice isn't going to happen through violence. That's what it's getting at. Right? That's what it's getting at. When you go out and do violence, you're giving vent to your anger, but you're not accomplishing justice. Right? You're not bringing about justice. Verse 5, there is a man who is silent but is found to be wise, and there is a man who is hateful because he talks too much. Maybe I should stop there. There is a man who is silent because he has no answer, and there is a man who is silent because he knows when to speak. A wise man will keep silent until it is the right time to speak, but an arrogant and undiscerning man will speak out of turn. The man who talks too much will be detested, and the man who stands on his rights will be hated. That's an interesting...
I don't understand that.
Right. The man who stands on his rights will be... Well, basically, it's talking about a particular kind of arrogance. A particular kind of arrogance. Now, they didn't have, at this time in history, they didn't have rights like our Bill of Rights. Right?
Yeah.
They were talking. So rights here is more like the idea of privileges. Right? Like, I am from a certain social structure. I'm from a certain social class.
Stratus.
And so you only speak to me a certain way. Right? Or you don't speak to me at all because I'm here, you're here. Right?
Oh, okay.
Because of wealth or whatever. I'm here, you don't talk to me at all, or you listen when I talk to you. Right? That standing on his rights is actually more like standing on those privileges of rank, right? Thinking that you could pontificate, right? And you don't have to listen to.
So you're saying the person that does that, they can get up there and run their mouths and be just as stupid as everybody else.
Right.
Okay.
And they don't let anyone question them.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Right? Yeah, they won't let anyone question. The ultimate would be like the king,
Yeah.
right? Who no one can interrupt. Who would get up there and could just make a fool of himself, blathering on and on and on about things he doesn't know about. Right? That's what that's getting at. Verse 9, there is prosperity in the midst of adversities, but there is also a sum realized by a sale for a loss. There is a gift that will not profit you, and there is a gift where the repayment is double. There is a loss because of glory, and there is a man who raises his head from a humble state. There is a man who buys much with little, but pays for it sevenfold. A wise man will make himself beloved through his words, but the kindnesses of fools will be forgotten. The gift of a senseless man will not benefit you, for his eyes are many instead of one. He will give little but insult much, and he will open his mouth like a herald. Today he will lend, but tomorrow he will demand it back. Such a man is hateful. So basically it starts out talking about your finances, right? So they give the example, there's prosperity in the midst of adversities. Basically, even when the markets are down, you can still make money, right? That's what it's, when the economy isn't good, you can still make money. You know that. It's saying to, people who are merchants. There's also a sum realized by a sale for a loss. Right? Sometimes you have to cut your losses. Right? When there's a downturn. And so it goes through some other examples, but that's comparing it to in verse 13, a wise man will make himself beloved through his words, but the kindnesses of fools will be forgotten. Meaning he's comparing this economic ideas to relating with people. Relating with people. Right? Even if you're in the midst of a bunch of people who are not doing the right thing, not going the right way, right? You're the wise man in the ship of fools, right? There's still gain to be had, right? There's still gain to be had, and you can continue to interact with these people profitably, right? That's what he's aiming at. But you have to be careful. You have to be shrewd the same way you do in the market. Verse 16, a fool will say, I have no friend, and I get no thanks for my good deeds. Those who eat my bread are worthless in their speech. How many will laugh scornfully at him, and how often? Right, so he's saying, I go out and try and help people, but the people I help don't say thank you. Right? I go around, I don't know if you've ever met a person like that. I can think of some relatives, but I won't name them. You don't know them. but who walk around just all the time, they're unappreciated. Right? All that. Nobody appreciates all the things I do. Right? I do all this good, I work so hard, and I do all this. Nobody appreciates me. Right? They go on. And of course he says, how many will laugh scornfully at him and how often? Right? Keep telling yourself that. Verse 18, a slip on the ground is better than a slip of the tongue. Thus the downfall of evil will come speedily. A man without grace is like a story told at the wrong time. It will continue on the lips of the ignorant. A parable from the lips of a fool will be rejected, for he does not tell it at its proper time. There is one who is hindered from sinning because of his poverty, so when he rests, he will not be pierced with sorrow. There is one who may lose his life through shame, or lose it because of his foolish countenance. There is one who makes a promise to a friend because of shame, and needlessly gains him as an enemy. A lie is an evil disgrace in a man. It will continue on the lips of the ignorant. A thief is preferable to a continual liar. Both, however, will inherit destruction. The character of a liar brings dishonor, and his shame is continually with him. A wise man will advance himself with his words, and a man with discernment will please great men. A man who works the earth will raise up his harvest, and he who pleases great men will atone for wrongdoing. Presents and gifts blind the eyes of the wise, and like a muzzle on the mouth they turn aside rebukes. Wisdom hidden and unseen treasure, what profit is there in either of them? Better is the man who hides his foolishness than a man who hides his wisdom. So, what it's getting at there at the end is a little bit of what Christ was getting at in the gospel reading we had today, where he talked about you don't light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Right? You light a lamp, you put it on a lampstand so everyone can see it. The idea being, if we've drawn close to God and he's given us some wisdom, he's given it to us to share, right, with those around us. If you're a fool, hide that. Right? Keep your mouth shut then, right? Don't share that with everybody, right? But if God has given you some wisdom, if he's given you some understanding, share that, right? That's what we should be sharing, not foolishness and idle talk and the things we normally sit around and talk about.
Isn't it also saying, though, that you're actually better off hiding your wisdom than you are opening your mouth and saying something stupid? Better is the man who hides his foolishness
Than a man who hides his wisdom. Right. It's not saying to hide your wisdom. It's saying don't hide your wisdom.
Hide your foolishness.
Hide your foolishness.
Hide your foolishness. Yeah.
Hide your foolishness, right? You know, gossip and, you know, frivolous joking around, those kind of things. Feel free to keep that stuff to yourself. The good stuff, the stuff God reveals to you, the edifying stuff, share that with everyone, which is the opposite of what we do most of the time. At least me, myself, I spend most of my time telling bad jokes and goofing around and talking about frivolous things, right? That's what I spend most of my time talking about. And I'm a priest who preaches and does a Bible study. And still, if you weighed out the number of hours I spend talking about stupid garbage, it way outweighs the Bible study and everything. Right? So, you know, we tend to spread our foolishness everywhere, you know. And the really important things that we ought to be talking about with people, that we ought to be sharing with people, those are the things we keep private. Right? Those are the things we just, you know, take home and don't talk about. This is saying we should do just the opposite. It should be flipped. Chapter 21. My son, have you sinned? No longer add to them, but pray about your former sins. Flee from sin as you would from the presence of a snake. For if you approach it, it will bite you. Its teeth are like lion's teeth, destroying the souls of men. All lawlessness is like a two-edged sword, for there is no healing from its wound. Panic and violence will lay waste to wealth. Likewise, the house of an arrogant man will be laid waste. The prayer of a poor man goes from his mouth to God's ears, and his judgment comes speedily. And yes, this verse is where the expression from your mouth to God's ear comes from. Whoever hates rebuke walks in the steps of a sinner, but he who fears the Lord will return to him with his heart. A man powerful in speech is known from afar, but an intelligent man knows when he slips. Notice that in verse 6, whoever hates rebuke walks in the steps of a sinner. This is another one of those themes we've seen again and again in wisdom literature, is that we should welcome rebuke. We should welcome correction. Right? We tend to do the exact opposite. Somebody starts criticizing us, we're like, oh, that's a really negative person. I don't need negativity in my life. I'm gonna, right? We want the people around us who just support whatever we choose to do, right? The people who try and correct us. This is, again, the exact opposite. To hate rebuke is to walk in the way of the sinner, right? It means to just continue to stumble down this path because you're not willing to listen to anyone's correction of you because it sounds like criticism. Verse 8, he who builds his house with other people's money is like a man who gathers his stones in a storm. The assembly of the lawless is like a bundle of kindling whose end is a flame of fire. The way of sinners is paved with stones, but at its end is the pit of Hades. He who keeps the law controls his thoughts. The end result of the fear of the Lord is wisdom. He who is not astute can be taught, but there is an astuteness that increases bitterness. The knowledge of a wise man is like a flood, and his counsel will flow abundantly as a fountain of life. The inner workings of a fool are like a broken vessel, for he will not hold on to any knowledge. If a man of understanding hears a wise word, he will praise it and add to it. But if a self-indulgent man hears it, it displeases him and he turns his back on it. The explanation of a fool is like a burden on a journey, but grace will be on the lips of an intelligent man. The utterance of a sensible person will be sought in the assembly, and they will ponder his words in their heart. Like a house that has disappeared, so is wisdom to a fool, and the knowledge of a foolish man is words that will not stand up to examination. To a foolish man, instruction is like chains on the feet and like handcuffs on the right hand. A fool raises his voice when he laughs, but an astute man will smile quietly with some hesitation. To a wise man, instruction is like a golden ornament, like a bracelet on the right arm. The foot of a fool quickly enters a house, but a man with much experience will stand respectfully outside. A man without discernment peers into a house from the door, but a well-educated man will stand outside. A man shows his lack of education when he listens at the door, but a prudent man will be grieved by this disgrace. The lips of the unwise will describe things in detail, but the words of the prudent will balance the scale. The heart of fools is in their mouth, but the mouth of the wise is in their heart. When an ungodly man curses Satan, he curses his own soul. The whisperer defiles his own soul and will be hated in his own neighborhood. What's that about? When an ungodly man curses Satan, he curses his own soul. Well, there's two things going on there. First of all, because he's an ungodly man, he's following after Satan, right? So he's basically cursing himself. Right? But the second thing there is, when we get to the book of Jude, there's going to be this bit about how when St. Michael the Archangel was contesting with Satan over the body of Moses. You remember that in Exodus? No, you don't. It's not in Exodus. It's not anywhere in the Old Testament. It's only referred to in the book of Jude, and we'll talk about that when we get there and what that means for quote unquote sola scriptura. But when Satan and St. Michael the Archangel are fighting over the body of Moses, he makes the point that St. Michael didn't slander Satan at that point. Right? The idea being, even, they're taking the worst example you can. Even Satan, we shouldn't slander, right? Even Satan, we shouldn't utter sort of blasphemous, denigrating words. Rebuking him and telling him to go away, okay, right?
But telling him to go to hell is not.
Right. Right. Now, if that's true, if we're not supposed to do that to Satan, how much less should I do that to you?
Yeah.
Right. Being the point that St. Jude is making in his epistle, right? We go around and we curse people all the time. And he's saying, look, when St. Michael was battling Satan, he didn't even curse Satan.
By St. Michael being the archangel?
Yeah. He didn't even curse Satan. So what are you doing going around, stuck in Charleston traffic?
Had a few choice words to say.
Cursing out every other motorist on the highway. Yeah.
I have to think about wise and foolish, starting with verse 12. I don't understand about astuteness and increases bitterness.
Well, that's that same thing that there's that just being clever or intelligent is not necessarily a virtue. It's getting at that same idea, right? So it's he who is not astute cannot be taught, right? So they're basically saying if somebody's not mentally gifted, right, there's a limit to what you can teach them, right? Advanced mathematics, probably not going to be able to go there, right? But there's an astuteness that increases bitterness, meaning, referring like in Ecclesiastes. Remember, with an increase of understanding comes an increase of sorrow. Right? Meaning, obviously, if you're not very bright, right, that's going to limit how much you can know and understand. But just being very bright isn't necessarily a virtue either. Being very intelligent, you can also be just or more miserable than the person who isn't necessarily as intelligent.
Doesn't necessarily.
Right. And so he's trying to separate out intelligence or cleverness from wisdom. From what wisdom is. Those are two different things. And that just like wealth, intelligence can be good, it can be bad. Right? Depending on how he's in poverty, it can be good, can be bad. And wisdom, though, is always good if it's real wisdom, because it's a connection to God. Chapter 22. A lazy man may be compared to a filthy stone, and everyone hisses at his dishonor. A lazy man may be compared to the filth of manure. Everyone who picks it up will shake it off his hand.
Yep.
I don't know that needs further explanation. I think that's kind of self-explanatory.
Pretty explicit.
The disgrace of a father is begetting an undisciplined son, and a foolish daughter is born to his loss. A sensible daughter will bring an inheritance to her husband, but a shameful one is a grief to her father. An arrogant daughter shames both father and husband, and she will be dishonored by both. An ill-timed statement is like mournful music, but the chastising and instruction of wisdom are always timely. So this is, again, children can be a good thing, can be a blessing, cannot be a blessing, can be a curse, depending on the type of children. Verse 7, he who teaches a fool is like one who glues pottery together, or like trying to arouse one from a sound sleep. He who tells something to a fool tells it to a drowsy man, and at the end he will say, "What is it?" I don't know about you, but that happens a lot around my house. Trisha will talk to me for a good 5 minutes, and then I get the impression that she's asked a question at the end of it. And so I kind of go, "Wait, what?" Yeah, that's what he's calling us fools.
Yes.
If children live honestly and have wherewithal, they shall cover the baseness of their parents. But children, being haughty through disdain and want of nurture, strain the nobility of their kindred. Weep for a dead man, for he left the light behind. But weep over a fool, for he left intelligence behind. Weep gladly for a dead man, because he is at rest. But the life of the fool is worse than death. Mourning for a dead man lasts 7 days, but mourning for a fool or an ungodly man lasts all his life. Do not hold a conversation with a fool, and do not visit with a senseless man. Beware of him so as to avoid trouble, and you will not be defiled when he shakes himself off. Stay away from him, and you will find rest and not be exhausted by his insanity. What will be heavier than lead, and what will be his name but fool? Sand, salt, and a piece of iron are easier to bear than a senseless man. A wooden beam bound together in a building will not be broken loose in an earthquake. So a heart strengthened by reasonable counsel will not be afraid in a crisis. A heart settled on intelligent thought is like a plaster decoration on a smooth wall. As fences set on a high place will not stand firm against the wind, so a cowardly heart and the thought of a fool cannot stand firm against any kind of fear. Verse 19, he who pokes his eye will cause tears to fall, but he who pierces a heart reveals its feeling. Throwing a rock at birds scares them away, and disgracing a friend will break up a friendship. If you draw a sword against a friend, do not despair, for a restoration of friendship is possible. If you open your mouth against a friend, do not worry, for reconciliation is possible. But as for reviling or arrogance or revealing secrets or a treacherous blow, with behavior like this, any friend will flee. Gain your neighbor's trust when he is poor, so you may be fulfilled with him when he prospers. Stand by him in his time of trouble, that when he gets his inheritance, you may share it with him. As the smoke and vapor of a furnace precede a fire, so abuses precede bloodshed. I will not be ashamed to shelter a friend, and I will not hide from his face. If anything bad happens to me because of him, everyone who hears about it will beware of him. Who will set a guard over my mouth and a prudent seal over my lips, that I may not fall because of them, and that my tongue may not destroy me? Yeah, that was verse 23. Again, this is one of those things where he's flipping sort of your common folk wisdom and actual wisdom. You know, your common folk wisdom is, who do you want for friends? Wealthy people, right? People who have a lot of things, people who have connections, who can do things for you, right? Who's he saying to be friends with?
Poor.
Go and be friends with people when they're poor, when they're in trouble, when they need help, right? Because things will change, right? And if you're their friend at those times, then you can be sure you'll have a real friend when times are better. Chapter 23, O Lord, Father and Master of my life. That introduction may be familiar to you from prayer of St. Ephraim the Syrian. Do not leave me to their counsel, nor let me fall because of them. Who will set whips over my thoughts and the discipline of wisdom over my heart, so they may not spare me in my errors, nor neglect me in my sins? Lest my mistakes be multiplied and my sins abound, then I would not fall before my adversaries, and my enemy would not rejoice over me. O Lord, Father, and the God of my life, do not give me haughty eyes, but turn me away from evil desire. Do not let gluttony or lust overcome me, nor give me up to a shameless soul. My children, hear the teaching of my mouth, for he who keeps it will not be conquered. A sinner will be overtaken by his lips, and a slanderer and arrogant man will be made to stumble by them. Do not accustom your mouth to vows, nor make a habit of using the name of the Holy One. Right, that's getting to that. Remember when Christ said, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Right? If you don't take God's name, you can't take it in vain. Right? That's the idea. For as a servant who is continually beaten will not lack bruises, so also he who makes a vow and continually names the Holy One will never be cleansed from sin. A man who swears many oaths will be filled with lawlessness, and that plague will not depart from his house. If he offends, his sin will be on him, and if he overlooks it, he has sinned doubly. If he swears in vain, he will not be declared righteous, for his house will be filled with trouble. There is a way of speaking comparable to death. May it not be found in the inheritance of Jacob. For all these things will be far from the ungodly, and they will not be involved in sins. Do not accustom your mouth to lewd expressions, for this is sinful speech. Remember your father and mother when you sit in counsel with great men, lest you forget yourself in their presence, and by habit act foolishly. Then you will wish you had never been born, and you will curse the day of your birth. A man accustomed to abusive words will never discipline himself as long as he lives. Verse 16, 2 kinds of men multiply sins, and a third kind will bring down wrath. This device here, this 2 and 3. I'm going to pause here for it because we're going to see this. We're going to see this a lot when we get into the prophets, which is going to be here probably in September. We're going to start Hosea. This is our last book of wisdom literature. This is a really popular. There's 2 and then a third, where you'll get for 3 sins and for 4. And it's basically a device to say, where you're sort of multiplying. So God will say, for 3 sins of Damascus and for 4, he goes after Damascus. Not to offend any Syrians. But for 3 sins of Damascus and for 4, I will not show mercy upon her. And then he'll list, here's 3 things. They oppress the widow, the rest of the poor, and then list a 4th. Like the 4th is sort of the final straw. So that's the same kind of idea here. There's 2 kinds of men who multiply sins. There's a 3rd who brings down rather the last straw, right? The worst of them all. A soul heated like a burning fire will not be quenched until it is consumed. A man whose whole body is given to fornication will not cease until the fire burns out. To a man who is a fornicator, all bread is sweet. He will not grow weary until he dies. Right, so that all bread is sweet is sort of like you talked about greed, right? Fornication, lust. It's another one of those sins where it's never satisfied. You never reach a point where you're like, well, my lust is satisfied for the moment, right? It never hits an end point, right? You're constantly being driven by it to worse and worse sin. Verse 18, the man who transgresses against his marriage bed says to himself, who sees me? Darkness encircles me, the walls of my house hide me, and no one sees me. Why should I be afraid? The Most High will not remember my sins. His fear is the eyes of men, and he does not know that the eyes of the Lord are 10,000 times brighter than the sun, and look upon all the ways of men and observe even the secret places. Right? So this man, he's cheating on his wife, and he thinks because he's kept it secret from men that he's kept it secret from God. Right? And that's no. No. Verse 20, before all things were created, everything was known to him, and the end of all things is also known to him. The adulterer will be punished in the city streets, and where he does not suspect it, he will be seized. So also the woman who forsook her husband and brought in an heir by another man. For she first disobeyed the law of the Most High, and second she transgressed against her husband, and third in her fornication she committed adultery and bore children by a stranger. She'll be brought before the assembly, and there shall be a visitation of her children. Her children will not take root, and her branches will not bear fruit. She will leave behind her memory as a curse, and her disgrace will not be blotted out. Those left behind will know there is nothing better than the fear of the Lord, and there is nothing sweeter than to give heed to the Lord's commandments. Chapter 24, wisdom will praise herself, and in the midst of her people she will boast. In the assembly of the Most High she will open her mouth and boast in the presence of his host. I came forth from the mouth of the Most High and covered the earth like a mist. That will stop right there. This is wisdom speaking, right? It starts, I came forth from the mouth of the Most High. What comes out of someone's mouth? Word. Right? That's the idea. Again, we're going forward to St. John's Gospel in the beginning. The Word who was in the beginning with God. Right? And who was God. From his mouth. Covered the earth like a mist. Right? Remember in Genesis 2, that version of the creation of the world, there's no plant life. Right? Because there's no rain and there's no man to work the ground. And so God causes a mist to rise up over the earth, and that mist is what brings forth life on the earth. So that's in Genesis 1. So this covered the earth like a mist is this reference back to that brings forth life and is there at the creation. Verse 4, I pitched my tent in the high places and my throne on the pillar of cloud. You remember where the pillar of cloud was that led Israel out of Egypt. I alone encircle the ring of heaven, and I walk in the depth of the abyss. In the waves of the sea and all the earth, and in every people and nation I have gained a possession. With all these I have sought a place to rest. In one inheritance will I lodge. Then the Creator of all things commanded me, and He who created me gave me a place to live. He said, pitch your tent in Jacob, and receive an inheritance in Israel. Before the age He created me from the beginning, and in the age to come I will not cease. I serve before Him in His holy tabernacle, Therefore I am established in Zion. In the beloved city likewise he gives me rest, and my authority is in Jerusalem. I am firmly rooted among an honored people, among the Lord's portion, his inheritance. So there's that picture 10 in Jacob, remember the tabernacle, right? So we had the pillar of cloud, the tabernacle, right? The presence of God filled the tabernacle. Also, in verse 10, I serve before him in his holy tabernacle. Remember that in a couple of years when we get to Hebrews. When we get to Hebrews, and he talks about Christ as the great high priest in the heavenly tabernacle. He's coming back to this. Verse 13, like a cedar tree I was raised on high in Lebanon, like a cypress tree in the mountains of Hermon. I was exalted like a palm tree in En-Gedi, and like rose bushes in Jericho. I was exalted like a beautiful olive tree in the plain, and grew tall like a plane tree. I gave forth the fragrance of aromatic spices like cinnamon and camel thorn, and I spread a fragrance like choice myrrh, and like galbanum, onyx, and oil of myrrh, and like the fragrance of frankincense in the tabernacle. I spread forth my branches like a terebinth tree, and my branches were glory and grace. I yield grace like a vine, and my flowers produce the fruit of glory and riches. I am the mother of fair love, and fear, and knowledge, and holy hope. I therefore, being eternal, am given to all my children who are named by him. What's this comparing ultimately Christ to? A tree, specific tree being the tree of life. Remember the tree of life back in Genesis, which is what man was cut off from so he wouldn't live forever in the state he was in. Right? Now Christ is the means to get back to paradise. Verse 19, come to me, you who desire me, and take your fill of my fruits, for the remembrance of me is sweeter than honey. My inheritance is sweeter than the honeycomb. Those who eat me will hunger for more, and those who drink me will thirst for more. He who obeys me will not be put to shame, and those who work with me will not sin. All this is the book of the covenant of the Most High God, the law Moses commanded us, the inheritance of the congregations of Jacob. Right, so what he's saying, this that I've just said, this goes back to Genesis, this goes back to Exodus, this goes back to Leviticus. This is the core of what the Torah was about. It was about this person. Faint not to be strong in the Lord, that he may confirm you, cleave unto him. For the Lord Almighty is God alone, and besides him there is no other Savior. The law fills men with wisdom, like the Pishon and the Tigris at the time of first fruits. And it fills them with understanding, like the Euphrates and the Jordan at the time of harvest. He mentions 4 rivers there. Remember the Garden of Eden? There are 4 rivers. 4 rivers that flowed out of it. This law shines forth instruction like light, like the Gihon in the days of vintage. As the first man did not know wisdom perfectly, so the last man has not searched out her depths. For her thoughts are deeper than the sea, and her counsels than the great abyss. I went forth like a canal from a river, and like an aqueduct into a garden. I said, I will water my garden and drench the garden beds. This is more that referring back to paradise. Behold, my canal became a river, and my river became a sea. I will yet make instruction shine like the morning, and I will make it shine far away. I will yet pour forth teaching like prophecy, and I will leave it behind for future generations. As you can see, I have not labored for myself alone, but for all who seek wisdom. This is probably a good place to stop for this week.
Is that chapter what they would use a lot in the early Christian church? Like, would that be? Because it really, even I can see that they're referring to Christ there.
Right.
They say you eat, you will not hunger.
Right. A lot of that language Christ uses,
Right.
you know, when he talks to the woman at the well about the living water, when he talks about being the bread of heaven, when he talks, right.
So this is why this whole got omitted then?
It's a bit, yes, basically. Basically. There was an effort, a deliberate effort by the leaders of what we now call Rabbinic Judaism, right? Which is the other type of Judaism besides Christianity that survived the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. There's a deliberate effort by them to choose texts and to focus on versions of text where there were multiple versions of the same book that were the least messianic, shall we say, the least able to be interpreted in the way that the Christians were interpreting them. So because the Christians latched on very quickly to the Septuagint translation in particular, right, and started using it. And it was only after that what we now call the Hebrew Bible came into being. So they were able to look at that and say, and choose other versions. And we have things that were written at the time this was happening. St. Justin Martyr, also known as St. Justin the Philosopher, who lived in the 2nd century. He was a Palestinian. He was from Nablus. Wrote, one of his works is a dialogue with Trypho the Jew, which is a debate between him and a non-Christian Jewish person about Christ. And he gives examples of passages that they've omitted or changed in their versions of the scriptures, with the references and everything. And he says, go to your synagogue, go and find the older copies, right? Go and find the original scrolls, and you'll see this is what it says. And then go and look at what's being produced now, and you'll see it says something. This has been a minute. Or they've switched the version, right? They've switched to another version of the same thing. So he gives examples. So I mean, it's known that happened. That they when they were picking, they deliberately chose the ones that. And I mean, to be fair, they would say that we as Christians chose the versions that most favor our Christian interpretation, which we did. You know? But so yeah, that's a big part of why this book, although because it was sort of a much beloved book at the time, it made it past the first cut. Ultimately, it was just too prone to the. I mean, it's really hard to read that chapter and not say.
Because a lot of the other stuff.
There's something going on here.
Things that they've said before about how to live. But
Right.
that's
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's chunks of this that are virtually identical to Proverbs. Right. So you can see how there wasn't a big. But then you get to a passage like that chapter, and some of this stuff we're going to get to some more like that later on. But at chapters like this one, where it's very clear that there's a God who is God but is separate from God, sort of, and that God was the presence of God all through the Old Testament, which is what it's saying, right? Comparing him to the tree of life and all this, where you're kind of going, that sounds a lot like God the Father and Jesus Christ. That sounds a lot like what St. Paul's talking about in the New Testament. And so one way, if you're Jewish and you don't believe that, to get rid of it is just say, well, that book's not canonical.
Sorry about
You still have two problems which are eternal. Nothing has changed. If you recall, Marcion started writing his own types of Gospels and New Testament.
Well, no, he just compiled it. He compiled
to become
a New Testament.
But you also have, too, the Gnostic Gospel, which you still get in the different bookstores, that these are the books that, you know,
which were written much later.
True, but that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Is that it is one of a distortion, okay? So the church continuously must tell the old story, going all the way back and bringing it forward so that its people hear that story.
Yeah. And so in a year and a half or so, when we get to the New Testament, we're going to be going into a lot of that in more detail. In the same way we've been talking about as we go why different books are in different Old Testament, when we get to the New Testament, we'll talk about how those books got there, too. Okay?
How would you know if something was divinely written or not, whether it be old or new?
Well, it's a good thing that wasn't how they decided. But I'll talk to you about that in a minute. I'll talk to you about that. I'll talk to you about that in a minute. Anyway, thank you, everybody. And as far as I know, I'm planning to have class next week. So next Sunday. So.
This book